Welcome to the Working with ABB 4-Wire Measuring Devices in Explosion-Protected Areas service training. A list of devices for which this training is suitable is available in the course description. In the course of this training, you will receive detailed work instructions for the various service activities for 4-wire measuring devices in different designs and versions. We will look into proper conduct when working in hazardous areas, since a few particularities need to be considered here. You will become familiar with key standards and regulations and the content relevant to you. In an optional training section, we will provide you with some basic information on explosion protection. Different national and international standards are valid in different parts of the world. The following description focuses only on the replacement itself. The user has to ensure that all local regulations, guidelines and standards are always fulfilled. Please keep in mind that any replacement of parts of an approved meter is the sole responsibility of the user and may be subject to detailed local regulations. Before starting work, disconnect the equipment from the power supply, observing the 5 safety rules in accordance with DIN VDE 0105. The replacement of any parts of 4-wire measuring systems approved for hazardous areas requires extra care. Inadequate handling of the replacement will endanger the health and safety of any personnel involved and will endanger safe operation of the installation. Depending on the approval, 4-wire measuring systems are protected by applying intrinsic safe circuits, potting and explosion-proof housings. All of these protection methods have to be secured. Please keep in mind that any repairs conducted independently on site are at your own responsibility and risk. ABB cannot be held liable for possible damages or risks resulting from on-site repairs not conducted by ABB personnel. The following slides describe how to work on 4-wire measuring systems and what you need to consider. If a cover on the front or back side needs to be replaced, screw the old cover off and check the thread of the head for cleanliness and integrity. If the cover still needs to be used later on, also check its thread and gasket for cleanliness and integrity. Set the cover on a clean and soft base, like a rubber mat, for example. If a new cover is being applied, remove the packaging just before using the cover. In any case, check it for cleanliness and integrity, and screw it tightly on by hand. The cover with glass panel for the indicator is available in different versions depending on the application for hazardous atmospheres of Zone 2 or Division 2, and Zone 1 or Division 1. The display can be removed by twisting it to the left by hand and then carefully pulling it out forward. If possible, unlock the display plug by hand. The lever to unlock the plug is on the right side. If you should use a tool to unlock the plug, such as for example a screwdriver, do so with utmost caution as to not damage the thread of the measuring head. If the thread in the head should become damaged in devices with XD or XP type of protection, the entire measuring unit needs to be replaced, since replacing the head in these devices is not allowed. Remove the packaging of the new display just before you install the display. Insert the plug by hand. While doing so, make sure that no pins are bent or damaged and that the insulation of the cable remains intact. The plug must lock correctly into place in the socket. Set the display on. It has a number of recessors, which makes it possible to install at various angles. Put the display on such that the indicator is in the correct installation position and twist the display clockwise until it locks in place. Finally, check if any housing parts or cables have been damaged during installation. Use a 7mm socket wrench to replace the display retaining pins. If you loosen the retaining pins using pliers, you run the risk of damaging the thread of the transmitter head, which would in turn require a replacement of the measuring unit. The reference values of the measuring sensors are factory set in the sensor memory. False reference values in the sensor memory would lead to incorrect measured values of the transmitter, which is why the sensor memory is firmly attached to the sensor plug. We recommend that you reattach the new sensor firmly to the sensor plug using a cable tie. The display must be removed to replace the front end board. You have already learned this step in the chapter on replacing the display. There are two versions of the front end board, an older version with ground terminal and a newer version which no longer has the ground terminal. Since a changed motherboard must also be used with the new version, a replacement may only be made 1-to-1. If a new generation front-end board is to be used, an appropriate new generation motherboard also needs to be used. If the board has a ground terminal, loosen it using a Phillips screwdriver. Make sure you don't lose the screw. If it should fall into the housing, you need to remove it in any case. Carefully pull the sensor memory and sensor cable out. The sensor memory is firmly attached to the sensor plug. When doing so, make sure that the connection is not damaged. Then pull the old front-end board out. If the front-end board has a ground terminal, connect it to the housing now using a Phillips screwdriver. Tighten the screws. The front-end board can now be attached. This clicks into the locking mechanism of the housing. Afterwards, attach the sensor memory and sensor cable. Check the sensor cable to make sure it is not jammed or damaged. If it is damaged, the entire transmitter needs to be replaced. Finally, attach the display and close the transmitter. We have already shown you how to do that in the chapter on replacing the display. There is no front-end board in the transmitter with a round housing. There are a number of optional modules, for example, for current output, for the Profibus, and for pulse output. For a complete list of available modules, refer to the current operating instructions. If there are optional modules in the transmitter, they may be replaced 1-to-1. An expansion of modules or an exchange for another version may be made at the factory only, since for this a retest of the transmitter with use of the transmitter in hazardous atmosphere is required. If you need to replace an optional module, carefully push both terminals outwards to unlock the module and pull the module out. Then insert the new module and check to make sure that it has correctly locked into place. The motherboard is available in a high voltage and low voltage version. During replacement, it is imperative to make sure that you use the correct version to prevent damage to the transmitter. If the motherboard needs to be replaced, take utmost caution to make sure that the transmitter head housing and the contacts are not damaged. If the thread of the housing or the contacts in the housing are damaged, the entire transmitter must be replaced. To replace the motherboard, the display and the front-end board need to be removed first. You have already learned how that works from the previous chapters. Use a Phillips screwdriver to loosen both screws. Afterwards, remove the hexagonal threaded bolts using a 7mm socket wrench and carefully pull the motherboard out. When doing so, make sure that the sensor cables are not damaged. Make sure that the contacts are not damaged or bent, and that the thread of the transmitter head and the sensor cable are intact. Then, carefully set the new motherboard straight in and fasten it using both Phillips head screws and the hexagonal threaded bolts. Afterwards, the transmitter head can be put back in, as was explained in the previous chapters. For the replacement, open the transmitter head on the back side and loosen the cable connection cover. Disconnect the connection leads of the transmitter and loosen both screws using a Phillips screwdriver and hexagonal threaded pin using a 6mm socket wrench. Proceed with caution to avoid damaging the housing thread. Then, pull the EMC board out. Make sure that the contactings are not damaged or bent and that the thread of the transmitter head is intact. Installation is executed in the reverse sequence. Insert the new EMC board straight in. Here, make sure that the plug contacts are not bent or damaged. The plug of the EMC board fits perfectly into the slot of the motherboard. For this reason, it is essential that the EMC board is inserted straight in. Now, screw the EMC board tight using a 6mm socket wrench and a Phillips screwdriver. Then the connection leads can be put back on and the cover can be screwed on. Finally, screw on the transmitter head cover. Make sure that the thread and sealing ring are clean and without damage. The transmitter fuse is a screw-type fuse. Replace it with fuses having the same protection only. The fuse should be replaced in accordance with the provisions in the operating manual. If a cover on the front or back side needs to be replaced, screw the old cover off and check the thread of the head for cleanliness and integrity. If the cover still needs to be used later on, also check its thread and gasket for cleanliness and integrity. Set the cover on a clean and soft base, like a rubber mat, for example. If a new cover is being applied, remove the packaging just before using the cover. In any case, check it for cleanliness and integrity, and screw it tightly on by hand. The cover with glass panel for the indicator is available in different versions depending on the application for hazardous atmospheres of Zone 2 or Division 2, and Zone 1 or Division 1. The connection cable needs to be removed to replace the terminal block. Then you can loosen the terminal block using a Phillips screwdriver. Make sure that no screws fall into the housing. You can now remove the old terminal block. Insert the new terminal block into the terminal housing and screw it on. Connect the sensor head wires crosswise. This means that the upper red wire on the left side is placed to the right on the terminal block, the red wire on contact 2 of the sensor head to contact 3 of the terminal block. The black wire on contact 3 is connected to contact 2 of the terminal block, and right black wire to contact 1 of the terminal block. The connection lead is placed as follows. The blue cable is connected to terminal 1 ground. The white cable is the 28-volt power supply for the sensor and is connected to terminal 2. The yellow wire is connected to terminal 3A and the orange wire is connected to terminal 4B. Then the terminal box can be closed with the cover. Make sure that the thread and sealing ring are clean and open the housing. The threads and sealings of the housing and of the cover are vital for the explosion-proof housing and must not be damaged in any way or be exposed to sand or dirt. Please put the cover to a suitable place. Store the cover in a clean, safe and protected environment during the whole repair process. If any of the threads are damaged, for example by tools, sand or dirt particles, it is not allowed to operate explosion-proof devices in hazardous areas anymore. In that case, order a complete replacement of the meter. Loosen and remove the 4 screws to be able to remove the transmitter module. The screws are different. Please remember the holes they were in and ensure that they match when screwing them in again. Unplug the sensor connections cable and unplug the sensor memory. Do not cut or damage any wires or plastic straps. Remove the old module and replace it with the new one. Ensure that the part number on the slide of the modules are identical. The revisions might be different. Plug in the sensor plug and the sensor memory. Insert the 4 screws into the appropriate hole. Tighten the 4 screws. Close the housing. The threads of the housing and of the cover are vital for the explosion-proof housing and must not be damaged in any way or be exposed to sand or dirt. Please check all sealings as well. They must not be damaged in any way. If threads or sealings are damaged, the meter must not be used in hazardous areas anymore. In that case, please replace the complete meter. In the mining industry, chemical or petrochemical sectors, and in many other industries, flammable substances in the form of gases or fumes are released during manufacturing, processing, or transport. Flammable dust also develops in many other processes, above all in the food industry. Mixed with oxygen at a certain concentration, these gases, fumes and dust create an explosive mix. When ignited, this mix leads to explosions which can have severe consequences for people and material. But how does an explosion actually occur? An explosion is the sudden chemical reaction of a flammable substance with oxygen with the simultaneous release of energy. Flammable substances can appear in the form of gases, fumes, mist, or dust. An explosion can occur only if 3 factors appear simultaneously. 1. A flammable substance in appropriate dispersion and concentration is needed. 2. This needs to come into contact with oxygen from the air. And finally, 3. A source of ignition is needed. A hazardous atmosphere is a state in which a hazard for people or material goods exists when ignition takes place. A hazardous atmosphere of just a few liters can already be dangerous in a closed space. Hazardous areas are divided into zones to facilitate the selection of appropriate devices, as well as the design of proper electric installations. The zoning reflects the probability of the occurrence of a hazardous atmosphere. Labeling for electric devices for use in hazardous atmospheres is defined in IEC 60079-0. In addition to the manufacturer, type designation, serial number, and test certificate, a special coding is stipulated here that describes the use of the device. 1. The X symbol. 2. Symbol of any type of protection used, for example, X, D, E. 3. Device group. 4. Temperature class for devices in explosive gas areas, or the maximum surface temperature class for devices in explosive dust areas, as well as the 5. Device protection level. Here, G stands for explosive gas areas and D for explosive dust areas, each followed by A, B, or C for the device protection level. The devices used in the defined hazard zones must fulfill the requirements of the respectively allocated device categories or the device protection level. The use of devices or even spare parts of a device with an incorrect IP rating is therefore absolutely impermissible. The components may basically be replaced only one-to-one. This means that when replacing an assembly of a Zone 1 or Division 1 device, only an assembly with the same Zone 1 or Division 1 IP rating may be used. The exchange of assemblies between each other should also be avoided, since the approval of the measuring unit can be invalidated due to differing IP ratings or even differing assembly versions. Replacing assemblies with different assemblies is also rarely permissible. The approval of the measuring unit is also invalidated in this case. Any change in configuration can only be made at the factory. Open only those areas of the housing which need to be opened for the respective activity. Housings of explosion-proof electric devices should be closed for as long as possible during assembly and installation. This means that they should be opened for no longer than necessary to conduct electrical connections and other required test and setting work. We know from experience that keeping the housing open for longer periods of time leads to increased collection of humidity and pollution inside the device. This impairs the condition of the creepage paths on insulation surfaces and can lead to the formation of creepage distances and therefore to short circuits over longer periods of time. After the assembly and installation work is completed, the device should be checked for humidity or pollution and cleaned and dried if necessary. Make sure that no unnecessary parts, such as plugs, cables or wires, insulation or also tools, remain in the housing. Special care is required when working on installations which are to be used in hazardous areas. Check if the required tools and measuring devices are approved for use in hazardous atmospheres. You can identify this by the respective symbols on the nameplates, which you have already become familiar with. The use of smartphones, tablets or computers is of course generally forbidden when working in hazardous atmospheres. Set all components which will be used on a soft and clean base. Check all components which are to be reused for damage. If you discover defects in the thread on a cover or defective sealing rings, these parts need to be replaced in any case. Check other components as well. In particular, pins on contact strips may not be damaged or twisted. Cable insulation must be completely intact. Check that cables have been correctly fastened to the plugs. Insulation may not be inserted too far out, so bare cables can be detected, nor may the insulation be set too far into the plug contacts. If the thread in the head should become damaged in devices with XD or XP type of protection, the entire measuring unit needs to be replaced, since replacing the head in these devices is not allowed.